The sky above the broken colony world burned like the edge of a dying star, heavy with smoke, dust, and the ghostly shimmer of shattered metal drifting down from the orbiting wrecks. The war had left nothing untouched. Forests had turned into seas of blackened stumps, rivers ran thick with ash, and the ground itself trembled from the weight of weapons no world should ever have endured. Among the ruins lay the bodies of soldiers from two species, both alien and human, scattered together in a silence so deep it felt like time itself was holding its breath. In the middle of that silence, not far from the ruins of a once towering defense wall, an alien warrior struggled to keep the light of her life from leaving her. She was covered in scorched armor, one arm broken, and her chest plate split open where a human rifle round had found her heart, but missed it by inches. Her breathing was shallow, her lips cracked, her vision a haze of colors she could barely hold on to. She had fought for hours, maybe days. It was impossible to know anymore, and every part of her body screamed that this was the end. For her people, there was no shame in dying on the battlefield. Death here, surrounded by enemies, would be considered an honor. And yet, something inside her still clung to the thought of air filling her lungs one more time. She did not know why. Boots broke the silence. Human boots, heavy and deliberate, pressing against the soil that her people had sworn would never be touched by outsiders. A small squad moved carefully among the ruins, weapons raised, eyes sharp. They were tired, dirty, bruised, but still alive. They had come not to fight but to search for survivors of their own kind, men and women who might still be hidden beneath the wreckage. None of them expected to find an enemy still breathing. The first soldier saw her body half buried in stone and ash and raised his weapon, finger tightening on the trigger. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. The alien warrior forced her head to turn, her eyes locking onto the humans. She expected the end to come quickly, one final shot, the clean mercy of an enemy who had no reason to hesitate. Instead, the human froze, weapon still raised but not fired. Another soldier stepped closer, scanning her injuries, muttering something under his breath. Their language was harsh to her ears, filled with clipped edges and strange rhythm. But she understood enough. They were debating whether she was alive enough to be a threat or too far gone to matter. One voice urged them to leave her, to save their strength for their own. Another voice, quieter but firm, argued that leaving her would be no different than killing her. The warrior tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came from her throat. She could not even lift her broken arm. In her mind, she told herself that it did not matter what choice they made, that she was already dead. Still, a strange unease moved in her chest, heavier than the pain of her wounds. She had been taught all her life that humans were merciless, that they burned worlds and left nothing but shadows behind them. If they saved her, it would not be kindness, it would be strategy, perhaps interrogation before execution. And yet, she saw doubt in their eyes. She saw conflict. One of the humans, a soldier with dirt streaked across his face and blood on his sleeve, finally knelt beside her. He placed a hand on her chest armor, feeling the faint, uneven beat of her heart. His expression tightened, as if something in him rebelled against the simple order to leave her behind. The others muttered again, their words sharp, but none pulled him away. He lifted his eyes to his commander, waiting. The commander was a broad figure with lines of exhaustion carved deep into his face. He stared at the alien for a long time, his jaw tight, as if measuring not just her life, but the weight of every life his squad had lost to her kind. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of distant fires crackling and the faint wind moving across the ruined fields. Finally, he gave a sharp nod. The kneeling soldier wasted no time. He pulled a medical pack from his belt, pressing a patch against the alien's wound. Though the device was never meant for her species, the warrior's body jerked in shock as The medicine burned through her veins, foreign and biting, but she forced herself to breathe again. Her vision flickered, and through the haze she saw human hands working over her armor, cutting, pulling, pressing. They were not gentle, but they were not cruel either. She wanted to fight them, to push them away, but her strength was gone. All she could do was watch, confusion twisting in her fading thoughts. Why? Why had they chosen to touch her at all when death was so much easier? The humans lifted her onto a stretcher, carrying her toward their evacuation ship. Every step jolted her body with pain. Every sound of boots on stone reminded her how close the end was. Yet, she was moving. She was not being left behind like the others. For the first time since her wounds had taken her strength, the thought of survival seemed more than a cruel lie. As the squad climbed the ridge toward their waiting vessel, the alien warrior let her eyes close for a moment. She could hear the low thrum of the ship's engines, the voices of humans speaking to each other, the rattle of armor and weapons. Each sound told her she was still in enemy hands but alive. Somewhere deep inside, where even her own people's teachings could not reach, a spark of something new stirred. It was not trust, not yet. Not hope, not yet. But it was something, and for now, that was enough. The medical bay of the human ship was a place of humming machines and white lights that never rested. Metal walls curved around like the inside of a steel womb, closing her off from the world she had once known. The alien warrior opened her eyes to that strange brightness, and for a moment, she thought she had already crossed into death. But the steady pulse of pain through her body told her otherwise. She was alive, though barely, and the air she breathed was thick with the smell of iron and strange medicines that clung to her throat like smoke. Around her, human medics moved quickly, their voices low but filled with urgency. They argued in their clipped language, some saying her body was rejecting the treatment, others insisting there was still a chance. They worked with tools that shone like shards of light, pressing patches of healing gel into wounds, checking monitors that displayed lines and numbers she could not understand. The alien warrior wanted to push them away, to remind them that she was not theirs to mend, but her body betrayed her. She could not lift her arms, she could not even speak. All she could do was watch with eyes heavy as stone. Her people had always told her that humans valued only their own, that mercy was a word they used only to deceive. And yet, here they were, pouring their strength into keeping her alive. She tried to find the cruelty in it, to tell herself they did this only to break her later, but the hands that touched her wounds were firm and careful. When one medic saw her flinch, he slowed his work, his brow tight with focus, his face not the face of an enemy but of someone who could not accept letting life slip away so easily. Time became a blur. She faded in and out of sleep, her body caught between fire and ice, every nerve fighting the strange flood of human medicine. Sometimes she thought she was back on the battlefield, hearing the roar of engines and the screams of her dying brothers and sisters. Sometimes she thought she was still lying on the cold ground, waiting for death to claim her. Then the brightness would pull her back, and the sound of human voices would remind her that she was somewhere else, somewhere she never imagined she would be. One night, or what she believed to be night. Though the ship gave no sign of day or darkness, the alien warrior opened her eyes and found a human sitting near her bed. He was the same soldier who had pressed his hand to her chest on the battlefield, the one who had carried her out of the ruins. His armor was gone now, replaced by a plain uniform stained with sweat and dirt, but she recognized him. He sat quietly, watching her with eyes that carried both caution and something she could not name. When he saw her stir, he reached for a small container, lifting it to her lips. The liquid inside was water, clean and cool, and though her pride fought the idea of accepting it, her body betrayed her again. She drank, each drop easing the fire in her throat. She tried to speak, forcing her broken voice to form words. But the sounds came out jagged and rough. Still, the soldier listened. He did not mock her weakness. He did not silence her. He simply nodded as though her broken words mattered. And though she could not understand his reply, the calm in his tone settled into her chest like a strange warmth. The days dragged on. Her wounds closed slowly under the constant work of the medics, though scars would remain where fire and blade had tried to end her life. The humans did not chain her, though she was weak enough that she could not have escaped if she tried. They spoke around her, sometimes glancing in her direction, as if she were a puzzle they did not know how to solve. Some looked at her with open distrust, their eyes sharp, reminding her that to them she was still an enemy. But others, especially the ones who worked over her body every day, seemed to see her as something more. The warrior began to think of death in new ways. Before, it had been her honor, the destiny she had accepted when she lifted her blade and swore her oath. But now, lying in a human bed with machines keeping her alive, she realized that part of her no longer wanted that end. It troubled her. It made her feel as though she was betraying everything. She had been taught to survive was to deny the song of her people, the song that honored those who fell in battle. And yet, when her eyes closed, she found herself dreaming not of glorious death, but of a breath she might take tomorrow, of strength that might return to her bones. One evening, when her strength had grown enough that she could raise her arm without pain tearing through her chest, the alarms of the ship echoed down the halls. Red light bathed the medical bay, and the medics rushed to prepare, their faces tight with fear. The alien warrior tried to sit up, but her body was still weak. She could only listen as voices shouted commands outside. The ship shuddered under impact, the sound of weapons striking hull, and she realized the humans were under attack. For a moment, she thought this was her chance. If the enemy breached the ship, she could be freed, or death could come to her in the way her people would honor. But as the shaking grew worse, one of the medics stumbled and nearly fell, and without thinking she reached out, catching him before he struck the ground. The motion tore at her wounds, but she did not let go. He looked at her with wide eyes, as though he could not believe that an enemy had saved him from harm. The alarms faded after what felt like endless minutes. The humans had survived the attack, though the scars on the ship told how close it had been. The medic she had caught looked at her differently now. Not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as something he could not quite put into words. She saw it in his eyes, and though she turned her gaze away, she felt the truth settle in her chest. The walls between her and these humans were still high, but a crack had opened. And once a crack forms, even the strongest wall can begin to break. The days blended together inside the human ship as it drifted through the stars. But for the alien warrior, each passing hour carried its own weight. She had begun to breathe without pain, to sit upright without the machines that hummed around her. And though her body remained scarred and fragile, her spirit was no longer hanging between life and death. She still remembered the battlefield, the smoke, the screams of her people, the crushing certainty that her story was ending there among the ruins. Yet every breath she now took was proof that the humans had refused to let that ending come, and the truth of it unsettled her more than the wounds ever had. The humans treated her with caution, as if she were a storm held behind fragile glass. But no chains bound her wrists and no weapons were pressed against her back. The medical bay had become her world, a place of lights and sounds and strange smells, and though she longed for the open skies of her own world, she could not deny that here, at least she was alive. Sometimes she wondered if that was mercy or cruelty, but the answer never came. One evening she tried to rise from her bed, her legs weak and shaking, and though she nearly fell, the same soldier who had carried her from the battlefield caught her arm. His hands were steady and strong, his eyes watching her with patience rather than anger. He guided her slowly across the floor, each step a test of will, until she collapsed back onto the bed with breath ragged but pride unbroken. He said something in his language, and though she could not understand the words, the tone carried encouragement, a reminder that even small steps were steps forward. For the first time in her life, she realized that an enemy's voice could hold warmth. The barrier of language was heavy between them, yet fragments began to break through. With the help of translation devices and gestures, the humans taught. Her simple words: water, pain, help, thank you. She spoke them with hesitation, her tongue unfamiliar with the sounds. But when the humans heard her try, their eyes lit with a spark of surprise. They answered back with words from her own language, clumsy and broken, but still attempts to meet her halfway. The exchanges were awkward, filled with mistakes, yet each one chipped away at the silence that had once been a wall. In these quiet moments, she found herself remembering her people's teachings. She had been raised to believe that humans were beasts in the shape of men, destroyers who showed kindness only as a mask for conquest. But when she saw a medic pause to adjust her blanket so she would not shiver, or when another left food on her tray, though he knew she could barely eat it, she began to feel the first cracks in that belief. Cracks that frightened her more than any wound. If her teachers had been wrong about this, what else had they been wrong about? Her pride still fought against the idea of accepting their care. At times she turned her face away, refusing food, refusing comfort, clinging to the thought that a warrior should not live by the hands of enemies. But pride could not keep her body alive, and her body, no matter what her spirit whispered, wanted to live. Each time she swallowed their water, each time she allowed them to dress her wounds, she felt herself drifting further from the warrior's death she had once been ready to embrace. The turning point came one cycle, when the ship was struck again by sudden attack. Sirens wailed through the halls, the red glow of emergency lights spilling across the walls. She was still too weak to fight, but when the hull shook under the blast of enemy fire, fear rose in her chest sharper than she expected. Not fear of her own death, but fear for the humans who had carried her this far. She listened as soldiers rushed past the medical bay, their boots hammering against the floor, and in that moment she realized she no longer wished for them to fall. Fighting was brief but fierce, the roar of engines and the tremor of weapons echoing through the ship. A blast rocked the medical bay, and one of the medics stumbled, a heavy crate toppling toward him. Without thought she moved, her arms still, weak but her instincts stronger, and she pushed him clear of the falling weight. Pain seared through her ribs as she collapsed, but the medic's wide eyes told her what words could not. She had acted not as an enemy, not as a prisoner, but as someone who cared if a human lived. After the danger passed, the medic stayed by her side, his expression caught between gratitude and disbelief. He pressed a hand to his chest, then to hers, a gesture she understood without the need for words. She turned away, unwilling to face what she had done, yet the truth settled heavy. In her chest, somewhere between life and death, between pride and survival, she had crossed a line she could never uncross. From that day forward, the humans looked at her differently. Some still watched with suspicion, their eyes sharp and cold, but others softened. They spoke to her more, even laughed when her attempts at their language came out twisted and strange. She found herself answering with the same awkwardness, and though the sounds felt unnatural, the laughter that followed eased something inside her that had long been frozen. At night, when she lay alone in the quiet hum of the machines, she thought of her people and the oaths she had sworn. She had promised to fight until her last breath, to never bend before the enemy. Yet she had bent already, not in chains but in choice. She had chosen to drink their water, to learn their words, to save one of their own. And though a part of her whispered that she had betrayed her blood, another part whispered something else, something she could not silence. It whispered that perhaps survival was not betrayal, that perhaps living could hold honor too, if it was lived with meaning. The alien warrior closed her eyes and listened to the steady rhythm of the ship as it carried her through the endless dark. She no longer knew what awaited her, whether death or something far stranger. But for the first time since her wounds had struck her down, she found herself wanting to see what lay beyond tomorrow. The ship sailed quietly through the endless dark for many days after the last attack, its wounded hull patched by human hands, its engines carrying both soldiers and their unexpected guest away from the battlefield. To the alien warrior, each day inside the metal vessel was a strange dream where the world of her people seemed to drift further away. She had begun to walk again, her steps uncertain but stronger, guided by the humans who no longer looked at her only with suspicion. She listened to their voices, learned more of their words, felt the shift in the air each time they spoke to her, not as an enemy, but as something closer to an ally. Yet even as the walls between them weakened, the shadow of distrust remained. She felt it in the commander's gaze, heavy with the memory of the lives lost in battles she had once fought against them. That shadow returned in full force when the ship was pulled into a sudden ambush deep in the uncharted lanes between stars. The alarms screamed louder than before, the red lights bathing every corridor in a glow that felt like blood. The engines shuddered as blasts struck from outside, and the voice of the commander rang through the halls, calling every soldier to battle stations. The alien warrior stood in the medical bay, her hand braced against the wall, her body still scarred and weak, but her heart burning with something new. She could feel the rage of enemy ships outside, ships she recognized by the rhythm of their weapons and the angle of their attack. They were hers once, her people, the same who had taught her that humans deserved only death. The soldiers ran past her, their weapons charged, their eyes wide with urgency. None stopped to order her back to her bed, none wasted time on chains or guards. They had no time, and she realized in that instant that she could choose her own path. She could stay behind, let the battle rage without her, wait for victory or death to come on its own. Or she could rise and step into the storm, knowing that this choice would mark her forever. Her legs trembled, but she pushed forward, following the soldiers toward the armory. When they saw her there, their eyes hardened, hands tightening on their weapons. The silence between them was sharp, filled with unspoken questions. Why was she there, standing in the place of fighters, when she was still their prisoner in name? She did not have the words to explain, but she had her hands, and she reached for a weapon on the wall, lifting it with the weight of her scars. The soldiers did not stop her. Perhaps they thought she would betray them. Perhaps they thought she would turn the gun on them. But in their eyes she saw something else too, a fragile thread of belief that maybe she could be trusted. The battle tore through the ship as enemy vessels closed in, their fire hammering the hull. The humans fought with grim determination, their voices echoing through the comms, their movements sharp with discipline. The alien warrior moved among them, her body aching, her wounds screaming, but her mind burning with purpose. She knew the patterns of her people's attacks, the tricks of their ambushes, the way they pressed into weak points with merciless speed. She shouted directions, her broken voice cutting through the noise, and though her words were not always clear, the humans listened. They shifted positions, reinforced shields, aimed their weapons where she told them, and slowly the tide of the fight began to turn. In the heart of the battle she found herself, shoulder to shoulder with the soldier who had carried her from the ruins. His face was grim, sweat running down his brow, but when their eyes met he gave the smallest nod, a sign of trust offered without words. They fought together, their weapons firing in rhythm, their movements aligned as though they had trained side by side for years, instead of only sharing days in silence and fragments of language. Each time the enemy pushed, they pushed back harder, and the ship held firm. The clash reached its peak when a boarding party broke through the hull, armored warriors flooding into the corridors. They were her people, their armor marked with the same symbols she had once worn, their eyes burning with the same fire that had once burned in hers. For a moment her heart faltered, torn between blood and the strange bond she had found among the humans. The leader of the boarding party locked eyes with her, shock flashing across his face when he saw her standing not at their side, but among the humans. He shouted her name in their tongue, demanding she return, demanding she cast off this shame. Her chest tightened with the weight of his words, with the memory of her oaths, with the echo of the songs of honor that had guided her since birth. But she looked at the humans fighting at her side, at the soldier who had saved her life, at the medic she had once pulled from danger, and she made her choice. She raised her weapon and fired, not at the humans, but at the warriors she had once called her kin. The sound tore through the corridor, louder than the alarms, and the battle that followed was chaos. The boarding party fought with fury, but the humans fought with desperation, and the alien warrior fought with a strength born of both. She struck down those who had once been her brothers, her body shaking with every blow, her heart breaking even as her resolve hardened. She knew there would be no return to her people now, no forgiveness, no honor in their eyes. But in that fire she found something else, a new kind of honor, one that was not written in the blood of enemies, but in the choice to stand for something greater than pride. When the last of the boarders fell, and the ship finally pushed free of the ambush, silence returned, heavy and raw. Smoke hung in the corridors, bodies lay still on the ground, and the air tasted of fire and loss. The humans lowered their weapons, their faces pale with exhaustion, and their eyes turned to her. She stood among them, her armor dented, her weapon trembling in her hands, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had fought not against them, but with them, and in that moment the line between enemy and ally had blurred beyond recognition. The commander stepped forward, his gaze hard as stone, yet carrying something new. He looked at her not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as a warrior who had chosen her place. He gave a single nod, sharp and final, as if to say the choice had been seen and accepted. She lowered her weapon, her arms heavy, her spirit torn, yet steady. For the first time since her final breath had seemed near, she no longer felt like she was merely surviving. She felt like she was fighting for a future that might truly belong to her. The silence after the battle was heavy as stone, broken only by the low hum of the engines and the faint hiss of broken pipes leaking into the corridors. The ship carried scars now, deep burns along its walls and torn edges along its hull, but it was still alive, just as its crew was still alive. Among the wounded and the weary stood the alien warrior, her body trembling from the weight of what she had done, her hands still remembering the feel of firing against her own people. The humans moved carefully around her, some eyes filled with wonder, others with unease, but none with the cold rejection she had once expected. She had bled beside them, fought beside them, saved them in their darkest hour, and that truth could not be taken away. Her legs nearly gave way as she walked back to the medical bay, each step echoing with the ghosts of those she had killed. The medic she had saved earlier hurried to her side, guiding her gently onto the bed. He worked quickly, sealing her wounds, pressing patches over scorched skin, his brow furrowed in concentration. She watched his hands move and thought of how strange it was that an enemy's touch could mean life and not death. She wanted to speak, to explain the storm that raged inside her, but her voice broke into silence. Words felt too small for what had shifted within her. The commander entered the bay soon after, his face worn and marked by long years of war. He stood over her with a gaze sharp as a blade, yet behind it lay something softer, something almost hidden. For a long moment he said nothing, as if weighing the future in his mind. Finally, he spoke in his own language, his voice steady but not unkind. She could not catch every word, but she heard enough. He called her no longer prisoner, no longer enemy. He called her one of them. Her heart stumbled at those words. She had never thought she would hear them from human lips. Her people would name her traitor now, her name cursed in the halls where songs of fallen warriors once rose. Yet as she looked at the humans who had refused to let her die, who had carried her from the battlefield, who had fought beside her in fire and blood, she knew this was not betrayal. This was rebirth. Days passed as the ship limped through space toward safer ground. Repairs were made, wounds were tended, and life returned to the corridors in cautious steps. The alien warrior grew stronger, her body mending slowly, her spirit learning to carry the weight of choice. She spent time with the soldiers, listening to their laughter, watching how they carried both sorrow and hope in the same breath. They taught her more of their words, and she in turn gave them pieces of her own language. Sometimes they shared food, strange and unfamiliar on her tongue, but eaten together, it became more than nourishment. It became a bridge. She remembered the faces of those she had lost, the oaths she had sworn, the teachings that had shaped her. At night, when the ship grew quiet, she thought of the path she had left behind, of the home she would never see again. The grief was sharp, yet it no longer bound her. She began to see that honor was not a chain tied to the past but a flame carried forward. And now, that flame burned with humanity beside it. The bond grew stronger when the ship finally reached a hidden outpost far from the front lines. The crew disembarked, bringing with them the scars of survival and the strange story of an alien who had stood at their side. Others looked on with suspicion, some with outright anger, but the commander silenced them with a single order. She was not to be touched, not to be questioned as an enemy, for she had already answered the question of who she was on the field of battle. Standing on the outpost's platform, watching stars stretch in every direction, the alien warrior felt a strange calm settle over her. She had once thought her last breath would be taken on a ruined world, her body left behind as a symbol of honor for her people. Instead, she was here, alive, her chest rising with steady breaths that carried her into a future she could not have imagined. Humanity had pulled her back from the edge, not only saving her body, but changing the shape of her soul. The soldier who had carried her that first day came to stand beside her. They did not speak, for words were not needed. He offered her a piece of cloth torn from his old uniform, the edges frayed, but the symbol of his people still clear upon it. She took it in her hands, feeling its weight, understanding the meaning. It was not a chain binding her to them, but a mark of trust, of shared blood spilled and shared life saved. She closed her hand around it, pressing it to her chest as though it were an oath. From that moment, she knew she was no longer only an alien warrior or a human prisoner. She was something new, something that belonged to both and to neither. She was a bridge built in fire, a living answer to the lie that mercy could never exist between enemies. Her people would never understand. Perhaps they would curse her name, but she no longer feared their judgment. She had found a new path, carved not in stone but in choice. The stars stretched wide before her, endless and waiting. She did not know what battles lay ahead, what trials would test her again, but she knew one truth with unshaken certainty. She had been ready for her final breath, but humanity had given her another. And this breath, this life, would not be wasted. She turned from the platform, her scars hidden beneath her armor, her steps steady now where once they faltered. The humans watched her, some with lingering doubt, others with respect, but all with the knowledge that she was no longer apart from them. She was one of them. She would fight not against them, but beside them. And so the alien warrior walked forward into the new dawn of her life, carrying not the death she had once accepted, but the life she had chosen, a life bound to humanity, a Life forged in mercy, a life that belonged not to the past but to the future. Her final breath had been near, but it had not been taken. Instead, it had become her first true breath, the beginning of a story that was hers to write, the end.